Speaking of hugging trees, it's the month to hug trees. We are welcoming in Chodesh Shvat. And of course, this is the month of Tu B'Shvat. So it's the month of blossom. It's the month where, even though, at least here, we're deep in the winter, the buds start to grow. It's a month of hope, of growth. It's a beautiful, powerful month. If we go right back to the start, it's the month where in the first Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, they discuss the fact that there are actually 4 Rosh Hashanahs. We happen to celebrate one in Tishrei, because that's the Rosh Hashanah of the years, but there are actually 4 of them. One of them is in Shvat. And there was a dispute between Hillel and Shammai as to when is Rosh Hashanah for the trees. And Hillel said it's on the 15th of Shvat, which in Gematria is 2, Tet Vav. And that is what we celebrate. But Shammai disagreed with him. And Shammai said, actually, the Rosh Hashanah for trees is tonight. It's on Rosh Chodesh Shvat. So there is a possibility that actually tonight is its own form of Rosh Hashanah. This is the actual birthday of the trees, even though we don't celebrate it as such. So it's lovely to be able to be coming together, whether it's the birthday of the trees or not. What I'd like to do actually this evening is something a little bit different. And I'm really hoping that it won't be a monologue and that I can hear your voices in this. I'd like to compare 2 stories that I feel are relevant, both in terms of the Torah reading at the moment and the month we're going into, but also for the times that we're living in. It's always a debate at the moment. You know, I was very inspired to hear that somebody from our shul has I think it's a 5-minute meeting every night with some friends. And the one thing that they're not allowed to mention is coronavirus. And there's something very cathartic in that, right? And normalizing. It's always this debate one has is like, you know, should the shir touch on it? Should the shir go away from it? Because actually sometimes we over talking it. And equally, I suppose that we read the passages in the Torah every time we read them about through the lens of what's going on in our life. Actually, Charlotte, after the last year, sent me a message asking something about the way I perceived it, and I owed her a response to it. But this is actually my response, that I don't think one can ever divorce one's own life from the way that we read the text. It's what's going on in our lives is what jumps off the page at us. And when we read it the next year and we're in a different place, we'll notice something else. And so therefore, these 2 stories are relevant every year in terms of where we're up to in the Torah cycle and where we're up to in welcoming in the month of Shvat. But I feel personally, they just resonate very, very deeply. I want to try and see what you make of them. It's kind of a work in progress. That's why I said I want to try something a little bit different and share maybe some reflections. And then I would love to hear your thoughts on it. Sound okay?
Yes.
Okay, so here's our first story. This is the story that we read in the Torah last week, and it is when the Jewish people have gone from riches to rags. They've suddenly become a nation of slaves, having been the great and celebrated just 2 weeks ago. Now they're suddenly slaves, and they're at the worst point of the slavery, and God's name hasn't been mentioned at all. It's really dark. At the same time, of course, the Egyptian prince Moses has had to flee the palace, and he's gone and become a nomadic shepherd in the land of Midian. And it's as he's caring for these sheep that one day he comes across a sight. And what is that?
What's the question?
The question is, when Moses is wandering after his sheep, he suddenly comes across an incredible sight, and he says, I'm going to have to stop what I'm doing and have a look at this. The burning bush, exactly. He suddenly sees what is called in Hebrew, it's not clear exactly what it is. It's called a sneh. And v'hasneh bo'er be'esh, let's call it a bush for now, okay? The bush is burning with fire. V'hasneh einenu kal, but it's not being consumed, right? So we've got lots of questions about this. If God's going to come to Moses and give him a calling, why does he do it through a burning bush, right? All the prophets had callings. It's that moment when you get the tap on your shoulder and, you know, God says, look, the world's in a really bad place. I need you to go and sort it out. Why through a burning bush? second question is, what was so epic about the fact that it wasn't being consumed? There must be some symbolism here. And thirdly, what exactly is, we're calling it a bush, but it's called a sneh in the Hebrew. We don't see it very often. What exactly was this bush? Anybody? Oh, goodness. Does that mean everyone's falling asleep already? Okay, I guess I'll just continue listening to my own voice then for a while. So, first of all, let's look at this word sneh. It sounds like something else in Jewish history that happened on the same spot. Sneh is with the letters samach and nun, sounds like Sinai. And in fact, the Ibn Ezra, writing in Spain in the 14th century, says Mount Sinai was called that after the burning bush because of everything that it stood for. But actually, when we try and kind of peel away exactly what it was, it seems that, and I actually have jotted this down because I can never quite get it right, it was a rubus sanctus. Anybody here botanists? It's the holy blackberry bush. This was a blackberry bush. It therefore was a sneh. It was a thorny bush, but it also had roses and blackberries, which is the nature of this bush if you go and look it up. And interestingly, how in the Latin and in the English, it's got this title of the holy blackberry, even just in its normal botany form. And so this bush that Moses happens upon is a bush that contains thorns, contains flowers, and contains fruit. It only, this can only happen, this phenomenon, when there is water flowing underneath. Okay, now, as anybody who is a botanist can tell, I'm really not. So those are the very few facts that I do know about this bush, but they do jump out at us as being rather interesting. And when we compare them to our second story, which also shares some of these features, I think it's kind of amazing. In the meantime, yes, very interesting. Karen's saying, isn't it the same one that the ram got caught in after the binding of Isaac? What's interesting there is that it probably wasn't, the sages try and tell us that it was the same place. Geographically, it probably wasn't, but it's about what it represented and its symbolism. And that really brings us on to, the question of, what did this symbolize for Moses? What is the symbolism of seeing a bush that's on fire and is not being consumed? What does it represent? Why is that the image that he is sort of startled by that throws him into the rest of his life of being the leader of the Jewish people? It's a powerful image.
Well, it's not natural. So there must be another explanation, i.e. Hashem.
That he has the potential, but is not using it in the right way.
Absolutely. Okay, so two very different ideas. One being that it's not natural. There's something totally miraculous about the fact that it's not actually burning. And this would have been something that, at least in the first instance, would have that's why he stopped. So this was kind of that changing point in his life. And from then he's going to live this life of miracles. And this is almost the introduction to it. And also maybe it symbolizes something else, which is that perhaps the bush could represent, I'm going to give two explanations here. Perhaps the bush represents Egypt. Egypt, the enslavement, is the place of thorns. It's a thorn bush. And as the sages say, it's easy to get in and it's very hard to get out. Right? You get in because of the way the thorns are pointed downwards without hurting yourself, but to get out is very, very hard. And of course, as a metaphor for life, so much of the kind of deep water we end up in, we think, how did I get into this so quickly? And yet I now cannot find my way out. Even now, this time of year, I don't know about you, but I've kind of been musing on like, this time last year, what was I doing, right? And then you say to yourself, gosh, yes, do you remember, like, Ellie was traveling and he phoned from the airport to say how these people were wearing masks because of this coronavirus that we had just started to hear about, you know, and all these things, but yet we were kind of like, well, some of us were perhaps naive, some of us weren't. And yet suddenly it was like almost, you know, we're catapulted into a thorn bush. To get out of that thorn bush is much harder. And so the metaphor there is that here the Jewish people are in Egypt. They're feeling downtrodden, but they are like the fire. That they, despite the fire that ravages them, they will not be consumed. They will be resilient. There's another way to see this, which is that the fire it doesn't represent their destruction, but rather fire represents God. The thorn bush represents the Jewish people. The fire remains in the thorn bush because as long as the Jewish people are having a hard time, God will be with them. And therefore the fire and the thorn bush will not be separated because God remains with them in that position. And these are the messages that God wants to give Moses as he takes up the leadership of the Jewish people. He needs to understand what his role is, that the Jewish people will survive, they will be resilient, even if it doesn't appear like that, and that God is with them, even though at the moment they don't feel that he is. Alex, were you about to say something?
Sorry, no, I thought I had another explanation about that, being that the fire, a bush on fire in the middle of a desert, had no business whatsoever being there, and it was a complete juxtaposition. And I thought that was symbolized also the fact that Moses didn't think he had any right or any business being a leader, and it was that comparison for him to draw on as well.
That he should be able to go back to Egypt, even though he doesn't feel that he belongs.
Or be a leader, become a leader.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, I just want to add to that point, so beautifully articulated, that a beautiful commentary that I just came across the other day, which was written by actually the Tyra Rebbe, who was living in the 19th century in Poland. And he writes in an incredible way. You know, perhaps it's from this sort of very black and white way that we learn the Bible stories as children, almost like a caricature. But I've always kind of envisaged a very gallant Moses who's shepherding and who suddenly comes across this bush. And he actually writes, God can see inside a person's heart. Moses was so depressed. He was so heartbroken at what was going on in the world that he was actually really, and he says he was in a deep, dark depression, are his words. And so that's why you see God reassuring him all the time and telling him, by the way, you should just know that Pharaoh won't let you go because his heart is hardened, not because the reason why he's telling him that his heart is hardened is so that Moses doesn't feel it's because of his own lacking, because Moses is so low in himself that he would have seen anything as kind of something to inhibit him going and succeeding. And so as Alex said, God has to give him every reassurance. And this all comes through the imagery of the burning bush. Okay, I'm going to add one more point to this, and then let's go on to our second story and try and put the pieces together. And the last point is actually written by a modern historian in Israel. Some of you may have been to the natural park, Ne'ot Kedumim, which is very fascinating. Anyway, the founder of that park actually said that when Moses sees this burning bush, what he actually saw was a fiery mirage, which is an optical phenomenon, which again, you see sometimes when there's in these kind of desert settings, when there is this water running underneath, which again is rare for the desert. So it ties in that actually this was in some ways natural, even though we said it was a total miracle, that perhaps there is some way of connecting this to a natural phenomenon that occurs. I want to right click on all of this and try and come back to the relevance of it in a few moments once we've looked at our second story. Would anybody else like to pass any comment on our first story before we move on? Okay. So at this point, of course, Moses is now going to go and he's going to take up the leadership. Much later on, the Jewish people have got the Torah. We have another story, which also involves difficult times. It also involves fire. It also involves flowering. Can anybody guess?
I
Someone said something, I just couldn't see who.
so they late.
Oh, I don't think she meant to say anything.
Matan Torah.
The giving of the Torah.
Yes, there's definitely something. The giving of the Torah, by the way, is almost, the burning bush is a microcosm of the giving of the Torah, right? It's also in the desert. There's also a fire. So there's a lot of parallels between the two stories. The fact, by the way, that the Ibn Ezra says that the whole of Sinai was called after this thorn bush seems to say a lot about who we are as the Jewish people. If Sinai is kind of our, our natural coming into being who we are, and that this was named after the thorn bush, perhaps that says something about our essence. I want to go even further on from there. And this is once the Jewish people are settled. Well, they're not really settled, but they've got the Torah. They thought they were going into Israel, but then they messed it up just before they went in. And so now suddenly they're destined to be 40 years in the desert, that all the adults are going to die out. And just when we thought that they're going to come to grips with this, we now have another rebellion. This rebellion comes from within Moses' own family, from his cousin, which is, of course, the rebellion of Korach. Korach's Moses' first cousin. He is essentially arguing that they should have more of a pluralistic society, and why should Moses and Aaron be elevated above everybody else? And therefore, they come together and they have kind of a sort of a showdown where they come together with 250 followers, and they all have to offer up incense. And this incense, when they burn the incense, this was a job that they were not allowed to do because it was only reserved for the priests. And therefore God says, move away from them. They're going to all get killed, and they all suddenly get killed. And you think, okay, great. The rebellion of Korach has been put out, at least for the moment. By the way, just before they get killed, Moses cries to God and he says, how can you kill innocent people with guilty people? If you're going to kill the innocent together with the guilty just because there are a few rebels, that's not fair. So then just the guilty people are taken aside. That's the first level. But the second level is that after this happens, all the people come to Moses and Aaron, the people that Moses had just prayed for to say they're innocent, save them. And they say, how could you kill off those people? You were so greedy for your own leadership, you allowed them to be killed. And at this point, a terrible plague breaks out. And it's a ravaging plague. And over 14,000 people are killed. And then Moses prays for the people. And God says to him, tell Eleazar to take the pan of incense, that same incense that people had been killed through, and go and stand amongst those people who are dying, and he'll stop the plague. And this is the very famous scene where he went and he stood between the alive and the dead, and the plague started to cease. Straight after this episode, God says to Moses, tell every leader of each tribe to come, and they're going to take a staff. We're going to put all the staffs together. They all came from Aaron's staff. And we're going to leave them in the tent of meeting overnight. They come back the next day. And what has happened? Aaron's staff has blossomed. And it has grown flowers and fruit and almonds. And none of the others have. And this is the symbol that despite all the protests, Aaron was destined to be the high priest. And just like there are flowers on his staff, his children were also destined to carry on this dynasty. Both stories contain similar elements. What is the meaning of this story at the time of Korach's rebellion? I'll just ask a few of my own questions. Why is it that that it was incense that stopped the plague? Why is it that he had to go and stand amongst them in order for them to be saved? Why was it that in order to show that Aaron should have been the leader of all things, it seems to have nothing to do with anything else in the story, it was all about the staff blossoming? Why did this show his supremacy? And how was this a peaceful end to the tales of rebellion in the book of Bamidbar? Anyone? These are just my own questions. You can feel free to add yours. Okay, I'll give a couple of...
Lauren, heavy.
Alex, can always rely on you to, break the silence, at least.
No, I'm just saying it's heavy stuff. I always like to lighten things up, you know me.
Good, please do lighten it up.
I can't on this one.
Okay, well, actually, in a sense, it lightens itself up, because instead of getting into everything that's happened, it's just like it moves straight on. And instead of dealing with the fire and the showdown, it suddenly moves on to buds and fruits and flowers. And even just within that, you almost like, if I was making a movie of it, right, you would have those scenes of Korach and the incense, they would all be like very dark. But then the scene of the next morning coming and seeing the stars would be a very light, bright scene. There's something that it heralds in, that there is new growth, that it's dynamic. It's not just something that was passed down that Aaron inherited for no reason, but it's something that he earns. It's something that is real, that is alive. And it also, in so doing, brings peace to everybody else. I'd like to give another explanation, and I think that this explanation ties back into our story of the burning bush, and then hopefully we can just put this together with some reflections to take away with us. And that is another question, which is, if God wanted there to be almonds growing, then just let almonds grow. And by the way, one of the reasons almonds were chosen, because almonds are the thing that grow the fastest. That's why the song that they sing for Tu B'Shvat in Israel, Hashkedia Parachat. Anyway, that's the Tu B'Shvat song that everybody sings, because it's the almond tree that at this time of year, in February time, you see the almond trees in bloom. They're the first ones to grow. And this was a message about Aaron, that he is the one who kind of stands above the crowd, and the flowers represent his children who are coming from him. But the almond also is bitter. It starts off being very bitter, and yet it's got super nutritional properties. And so there's also a symbolism within that out of this bitterness can actually come a harmony, that sometimes one has to actually air their views. It had to be brought up in public in order for it to then come together. But the one answer that I've seen as to why did it need to go through all the stages of growth? Why didn't they just come and actually the almonds had miraculously appeared? But instead it had gone through each stage of growth. That was the miracle. The miracle was that it had gone through each stage of growth, but it had still gone through each stage of growth. Do you see the difference? Mm. Yes. So there's another example of this. If we flick forward in time to Joshua, when Joshua was fighting a particular battle, they needed to get some extra time with the sun. Now, God could have done a miracle and they could have just had light during the night. But instead, there was that's the famous story of the sun, and the sun stood still. Shemesh b'Givon Dom, right? The sun stood still in Givon, and it waited until the sun set. It's the same question. Why didn't God just do some kind of open miracle? Actually, the power of this miracle was the fact that it came through nature, the fact that the almonds came through a natural cycle of growth, because nature itself is so powerful. You could say the same thing going back to the burning bush. If this was indeed a fiery mirage, then actually, instead of going against nature, it was about the miracle happening through nature. Putting these stories together, the two stories both contain rose buds and thorns. They contain fire, they contain flower, they contain bitterness, they contain harmony, and they have all of these elements alongside each other. These are my reflections on the two stories. Be interested to hear yours. First of all, the fact that they contain all of these simultaneously. So we have a little game we play around our supper table, which is called Rosebud Thorn. And it didn't come out of learning these stories, but these stories seem to resonate the same points. Rose is when you share something good that happened in your day. The thorn is the part of your day that wasn't so good. And the bud is your hope for the next day. It's interesting that they generally seem to exist at the same time. What Moses was being told by seeing this bush, which is a thorn bush, it's on fire, and yet it also has flowers, is that actually, rather than seeing the thorns and the flowers separately, so often both are contained together. What's interesting about when we play this game is that the rose and the thorn often are very different things for the same day. But then when somebody reflects on what their bud is for the next day and what they hope for, you can actually see them kind of, the cogs whirring, and often they're putting the rose, the thing that was good that they want to build on, and the thorn, the thing that didn't go so well for them. And they're trying to almost channel those together in their hopes for the new day, which is the bud. At our most critical experiences, and what Moses had to understand as our leader, was that it's not just about slavery and redemption, but that often the two are contained within each other. And that's why our greatest moment of Mount Sinai is named after the thorn bush, because we can't understand the one without the other. My second reflection is the fact that it was this natural miracle. And so often, again, I remember at the beginning of coronavirus, I was speaking to a friend of mine who's a GP, and she had just been very unwell herself with COVID. And she was saying to me, what should we be asking? She said to me, what should we ask people to be praying for? Obviously in your mind, you just want it to be over, right? She said, I think the best thing to pray for is that it mutates, right? But there was this thing of what's the best case scenario? Actually, and then I remember hearing Chris Whitty at a rabbinical conference that he came and presented to us. And he said, if we have a vaccine in 2020, I'll be really surprised. But if we don't have it by the end of 2021, I'll be disappointed. We had a vaccine by the end of 2020. And whilst I'm certainly not saying that we're living in a time of tremendous sunshine and glory, actually, in terms of what was hoped for, we made incredible progress with that. And I just wonder, looking at these two stories, we can either look at the vaccines and say that's the triumph of science over faith, or we actually say, when we celebrate the miracle of nature, the vaccine is actually a manifestation of our faith. That it's the greatest miracles happen through nature, just like they did with the burning bush, and just like they did through the staff of Aaron. And my third point, and the one that I think certainly resonates with me in the greatest way, and at this month of Shvat, is when we went back to the symbolism of what the fire was at the bush. If the fire represents God and the bush represents the people who are stuck in enslavement, the fact that the fire wasn't moving from the bush represents the fact that God remains with the people in their hard time, and until they're liberated, he won't be liberated. And what we saw was that right there and then, Moses starts to argue with God about how hard the slavery is. And when he goes back to Egypt, the first thing is he says, Lama Hariota, why have you done such evil to your people? Now I can see with my own eyes how terrible the slavery is. And we say, is this the right thing for a leader to do when he's just gone in, to start arguing on behalf of the people? We see the same thing in the story of Korach, how as soon as he hears that God wants to punish them, he says, how can you kill the people? This takes us back almost to Abraham arguing for the people of Sodom. And I want to just contrast it with one other very colorful figure. And with this, I'll close. And that is the prophet Hosea, who, by the way, also spoke of the power of the thorn bush. And there are a lot of comparisons between Hosea and Moses. But the thing that's interesting about Hosea is that Hosea, if he stands out for anybody, was his prophecy is a rather bizarre one, because he was told to go to a prostitute and to have children with her. And of course, this raises a massive moral question. And so the sages in the Talmud explain that there's a backstory to Hosea that we have to understand. And that's why his prophecy starts with the words "in the beginning." You need to understand what happened in the beginning. God comes to Hosea, and just like he came to Moses at the burning bush, he says, "I've got a job for you." He comes to Hosea and he says, "I need you to go to the Jewish people. They're really corrupt. They're doing terrible things. And I need you to go and tell them to do better." Hosea says, "You know what? If you're done with them, then swap them. You're right. They kind of, that's fine." And God says, "What do I do with this guy?" Right? He should have said, "God, what do you mean that the people you're with have sinned? They're your children. They're the children that you love. They're the children of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. You've got a relationship with them." So God says, "You know what I'm going to tell him to do? I'm going to tell him to go and take a harlot, to have children with her. And when he's had children, I'm going to go to him and I'm going to tell him to leave her." And that's exactly what happens. They have 3 children together, and God comes back to Hosea and he says, "Okay, it's time to divorce her." Hosea says, "But I can't just leave her. We've got children together. We've built a life together." And God says, "Well, then you see, if that's the way you feel, then I can't just leave my people Israel." This was the message that God gave Moses at the burning bush. By the fire remaining in the bush and the bush not being consumed, God was showing that whatever happens, however far people go, however much they don't feel that he is with them, he'll never leave them. And that's where Moses learned that his job was always going to be, whatever the people did wrong, was going to be to champion for the people. Because that's why God said to Hosea, "You need to learn from what Moses did." In the end, Hosea did learn, and Hosea was the one who actually taught us about the relationship we have with God, which is so full of love. To bring this then to a close, we also see how with the rebellion with Korach, it's Moses again who is arguing on behalf of the people. It strikes me that there are often times that we don't necessarily see the kindness of God all around us, that we see the darkness and we might even be angry. But that's okay, because that's actually the job that God gave to Moses. As long as we know that ultimately, when you're angry with somebody, it means that they're with you on your journey. They're still there. That's the image of the fire in the bush. And so it strikes me that here we are as we go into the month of Shvat, this month that's rosy, that's of blossoms and of buds. And in England, I've got so many messages the past few days that have said, "I'm having such a hard time," and the weather really doesn't help. In the summer, things might have been bad, but people could, the sunshine definitely helps. It's a small thing, but it's a tonic. And so there's something about it almost feels incongruous that here we are celebrating this month of blossoming and buds and hope and wonder. And many of us don't necessarily feel like that. But just like Moses, as the Tira Rebbe says, was actually in a very low place. He was feeling really, really down. If even Moses could feel down about what was going on, it's okay for people to feel down about what's going on. But they should then see that image in front of them of the fire within the bush, and to be able to dig down in their faith and understand that we are accompanied on our journey. And that even if we've still got a way to go, hopefully this month we will celebrate the greatness of the marathon of the natural miracles of more and more people being vaccinated, that hopefully we will surpass even Boris's hopes somehow in some way, and we will truly see a month which is that of blossoming and blooming. Now I'd love to hear your thoughts.
That was lovely, Lauren. Thank you. That was really lovely. I'm going to ask you something, and I don't know how this ties in. But the almonds, just when you were talking about almonds and the tree, there is, it's symbolic. It represents God's watchfulness over people.
God's what?
God's watchfulness over his people. And I just wonder how just tying that in. It means watchful apparently in Hebrew. That's what it means. And so when you talk about the almond tree and taking the almonds, and I mean certainly almonds seem to be all over the place at the moment. I down as many as I can during the day. Don't really know where I'm going with this, everyone, but it was just that word watchful and the symbolism of being watchful, of God's watchfulness over his people.
Yeah.
I guess
and also, by the way, the menorah in the temple had to be made that certain parts of it were in the shape of almonds. So the almond has huge symbolism. I think the fact that you have this, that it's quick to flour, right? That it is bitter when it starts, and yet its nutritional benefits as a superfood are huge, which is why you down so many in the day whenever you can, is also very symbolic. In terms of sometimes the bitter experiences we have to go through a lot, but there's huge depth within them. Oh, Khani wants to say something.
Hi everyone.
Hi.
Our school sent out a video today, and it was and like in the back, like they showed all different like to go with the video, like images and videos, and in the background talking was like part of it was our secretary, our head teacher, different teachers of ours, sixth formers. And it was like a video about like what is like this. I remember it was with the secretary's voice in the background. It's like it says in Mishnah that we're like celebrating like a month of like a new month. So like and of the trees, and like the trees being blossomy and almondy and everything. But like it's winter, so like there's no blossoms or almonds and stuff. But like this is like the time where they all grow. So it's like where it's being like growing and everything, so we're like praying for it to grow. And also what I was saying about stuff getting better, my little cousin Racheli, who lives in Brunsbury Park, around a month and a half ago, she wasn't feeling so well, so that just to be on the safe side, they went, she wasn't feeling so on Shabbat, and so on Sunday afternoon they went to get her a COVID vaccine. And when and when she came home, she said to her older brother, who's 8 years old, Yossi, what should I be, positive or negative? And Yossi said, oh no, you have to be negative. So she said to him, but I'm just trying to be positive, because like she just wanted to have a positive attitude, and he meant like your test should be negative. So it's like things have to be bad to get better. So like, yeah.
Very nice. Yeah, very good. I like that very much.
Thanks.
Very sweet.
The thorn and the flower. Anyway,
Lauren,
yes.
Lauren, it's Charlie. I liked very much your Devar Torah, and I liked your analogies of the thorns and the budding and the roses. And it just reminded me, and I'm sure it's not happening in your home, but I know that, being stuck at home, when arguments take place between my kids, Andy and I always try and use that mechanism of deflection, and how an argument can very quickly, lose control. And just that deflection of what's going on beyond COVID in the news or what else is happening can often, get the kids thinking and developing a much more positive, communication with each other, and, positive conversation flourishes. So that just reminded me, of the thorn, the bud, and the rose,
Yeah.
all the other way around. Just hoping that it does tend to make them think of positive things and other things beyond being entrenched in this argument. Anyway, I'm sure none of you are going through that at the moment.
I'd like to bring it all back round to hugging trees, if I may. Can I?
Please do.
Because while we're talking, I'm thinking God uses a lot of nature symbolism along the way, what with floods and natural and plagues and burning bushes. He's always using nature to teach us things, and hoping that we will learn from nature. And I think, I'm really hoping, it appears that people, the human race is beginning to learn from nature, in that we knew about this. We were prepared way back from SARS. We were prepared with trying to create a vaccine well before this all broke out. It just took the whole year to, as Nicola would, is Nicola still on, to go through all the research and testing. So we are beginning to learn from nature. And I think Hashem is beginning to get to us, finally. It's just the question is whether we learn from each other. That's the next step. And that is when we'll really excel, I believe.
Very well put. Nicola, do you want to weigh in on the SARS and the vaccine?
Oh, I just think obviously there's thorns and buds and things, you know, in viruses as well. There are good viruses, there are bad viruses, there are terrible viruses, and there are viruses we can learn from, and we exploit other viruses to cure COVID. So one of the vaccines is made from another virus. So it all fits very well. But we don't want to talk about COVID in this shift.
Yeah. Lots to think about.
Well, I think also the relief from COVID is going on the heath. Thank God for the heath. I mean, that's a miracle that was within a few miles of our home, so we're allowed to go on the heath. And it doesn't matter how many times you go on the heath, but it's rejuvenating. There's something very, so maybe that is why God is still residing more than, I know he's everywhere supposedly, but you know, when there is a real relief. You know, it's not just by chance you talk about hugging trees and the energy. And what I've started to do is maybe sort of look at the trees and the place in a very different way. So something that was there, and I have a dog, so I walk him anyway all the time, but there's still, you're looking at what you have and it with different eyes.
Yeah.
And I think also being Tu B'Shvat always reminds me, it was Natalie's bat mitzvah many years ago on Tu B'Shvat. And it was also coming out through it was all about, you know, the winter and the darkness and what you can't see and what is possible. And just going through that Seder and with the different cups of wine, sort of not knowing, I like what you're saying about the process and the process. Sometimes we don't know what you know, what is in the future, but if we have those seeds or those buds, there is that potential. And funny enough, I mean, it's just by the side, we didn't know what to do. Her real birthday was yesterday, or I guess her English birthday. So what did we do? We had nothing else to do, so in the evening we made her this surprise fire. So I thought it was a nice connection, and we had the nicest time outside at night in the garden with the fire. So I just thought it was another
Amazing. And
anecdote.
the thing that I remember about her bar mitzvah was the fires as you came in. Anyway, random connection. And it's funny what you say about the heath, because twice in the last while since this, do you remember when Rabbi Lau spoke, for any of you that were there? And he said, oh, I'm connecting with London, if what I would give to go for a walk on the heath. And I was like, really? Like, you could go anywhere in Israel and you're dreaming about the heath. And then my nephew was coming. He had leave from the army and he had to go somewhere. So he came here. And I said to him, you know, there's nothing to do here. You know, are you going to be bored? He said, all I want is to not have to wake up at any given time and to walk on the heath.
Without his gun.
I just want to walk on the heath. And then I kind of plugged that back in about what an incredible gift that, you know, it is, that it really is on our doorstep. And you're right, every time anew.
Yeah, me and Gabriella went for a walk, and like everywhere we went, it was all really pretty and everything sort of looked the same, but like every time you go to a really big park, there's like all different places you can go. And my Safta, my Sava, and they went to, I think it was Regent's Park, and they told me that they found like a secret passageway or something like that, or a secret compound, something like that.
Anyway,
It's a secret
anybody who's
garden.
bored, Chani can give all night entertainment.
Lauren.
Yes.
Hi. So I just wanted to add that I like the way you gave license, that it's okay to be angry about what's happening in the world, because I think a lot of people feel guilt about being angry, about not understanding why things are happening. And I think it was nice the way you kind of gave license, that it's okay to be angry and like kind of confused and not sure about why things are happening the way they are. like Moshe, like, you know, that Moshe was depressed. I think that was very nice that you said that. Yeah, I thought it was very nice. And also just, it was interesting because I'm reading a book at the moment called Think Like a Tree. And it's a really interesting book, and it just talks about how humans are so similar to trees, how we have such similar ecosystems in our bodies. You know, like trees have, you know, their branches and the, you know, the photosynthesis and all the stuff that makes trees function, and we have like our, you know, we survive on water, and we need sunlight, and it's so interesting. There's so much parallel between humans and nature. It's amazing.
Yeah. Amazing. And for anybody who doesn't know Shoshana, she's amazing, and she allows things to grow and be born. She was my doula when Hillel was born, so I am forever grateful to her. Yeah.
Oh, cool. My mum once had a doula.
And she's always looking for new clients.
Thank you, Laura.
Always looking for new clients. So if anyone knows of young ladies looking for a doula or looking to join an amazing course, combining art.
Okay. I have to add that Laura is my Heath partner, so we know the Heath very well.
So you see all these connections, but I'll just picking up on Shoshana's point for maybe at least one final point from me, that my great inspiration on this is actually Miriam Peretz, who some of you will remember from when she visited our community a few years ago. And her book, which for anybody who hasn't read it, is really, I think when my mum originally gave me the book, she said, this is the kind of book that's life-changing for people. And she called it Miriam's Song. And when she came, I asked her, why did you call your book Miriam's Song? And in the Hebrew, it's Shirat Miriam, like Miriam's song from the Torah when they crossed the sea, and Miriam led the woman in song. And she said, I called it Miriam's Song because I wanted to give validity to singing to God, not only when one's ecstatically happy, that in the loss that I've had in my life, sometimes I dance the tango with God, and I sing, and I'm angry, and that's really what the book takes one through. And she just is such an inspirational figure. You never know, she could be the next president of Israel. Wonderful to see everybody. Stay well.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful
Thank you.
Thank you very much.